So today I want to speak a little bit about balancing ego and spirit. So most of the questions I get concern the ego more than spirit. Questions such as how do we make decisions, or how do we motivate ourselves, or questions about how do we relate to thoughts and emotions to suffer less, or how can we be more compassionate or more generous? These are the kinds of questions I tend to get. Balancing these tendencies is important for living a peaceful, joyful life, as well as part of the process for seeing your true self. Right? So as you absorb these words, remember that you are already true nature, you are already spirit, but we most often simply overlook it because we're so enthralled in the content of our experience, in particular thoughts. Sometimes spiritual teachings can sound like concerns of the ego and concerns of spirit are conflicting, right? That you have to get rid of ego in order to realize spirit. I'm going to use the word spirit here. I'm referring to consciousness, awareness, the absolute, God, Buddha nature, pure mind, if you're from Zen. It's all the different words. I'm just using spirit. For some reason, it kind of was the word that came up when I was writing the talk. So I'd like to set this straight, this notion that ego and spirit are somehow conflicting, inherently conflicting, and explore ways that we can harmonize our ego and spiritual selves into kind of a symbiotic alliance where each supports the other, and where each supports our impulse to awaken to our true nature. So even after we see our true nature, ego continues to function, but in a different way, a completely different way. With awakening, ego really carries this expanded consciousness spontaneously and naturally into the world, into daily life. And just real briefly, I'll define what I mean by ego and spirit. Literally a sentence on each, because you've all heard this before. Ego refers to the amalgamation of psychological processes that form our functional personality, or our psychological self, that moves through the everyday world of conventional time and space. There's one sentence, I did it. And spirit denotes the timeless, formless, unconditioned dimension that's liberated from suffering and is experiencing a union with all life and the cosmos of the universe. So that's what ego and spirit, how I'm defining them for our purposes. So there's two aspects to the relationship between ego and spirit. First, we need to relate to the two dimensions as we move forward in seeing our true nature. And second, once we're dwelling in spirit more than we're dwelling in ego, we find that we relate to ego in a different way, in quite a natural way. One of my teachers, Matthew, recommended that even before awakening occurs, that we practice relating to the ego as if we'd already seen our true nature, because ultimately that's what we are. That's right, we're just overlooking it. And then when I heard that, it was kind of shocking. But then as I started to practice in that way, there were some deep revelations about how to live and balance with ego in the world and in my practice. We talk about how the ego has a tendency to reinforce the illusion of a separate self, right? And this illusion then obstructs the realization deeper truths of non-separation and impermanence. So in that way, the ego does block or cloud over our true nature. Spiritual teachings, and the way I like to teach, is to encourage us to recognize and transcend the ego. And some may take this to mean that I'm talking about annihilating or getting rid of the ego, but that's not really what I'm saying. As we move forward and we transcend the ego for moments, we need to cultivate a healthy relationship with ego. Right, a relationship that's characterized by self-awareness, by humility, and a shift in focus from self-centered desires to a more compassionate and spiritually aligned, you could say, thoughts and actions and deeds. So ego and spirit might seem like they're inherently contrasting and at odds. You could say at opposite ends of the spectrum of self, but they have a different emphasis, and we need to learn how to live from both. Right? Transcending the ego is just really the beginning. Then we learn to live knowing our true nature and how that then transforms how we act in the world. So egos are always they're always going somewhere, right? They're doing something. They're being a somebody, right? That's the characteristics of the ego. Always going somewhere, doing something, and being a somebody. Whereas spirits, it's always going nowhere, doing nothing, and being nobody and everybody. Everything. So the practice is then to relate to egoic tendencies skillfully, right? To relate to those ego impulses in a skillful way. And at the same time, spend significant amounts of our time dwelling in spirit. So that's why these guided meditations that take us from being lost in thought, being lost in the egoic mind, and noticing the gaps between egoic compulsions, which is usually thoughts, right? It's a lot of thoughts. But it can also be, just emotions and body sensations, sounds, just the whole tendency to grasp at what's going on around us in the external world. Relate to the ego and its tendencies in a skillful way and spend more time dwelling in spirit. And this kind of active participation in both realms really leads to a more fulfilling life and the possibility of seeing our true nature, of completely letting go of our fascination with ego. So it's not only about balancing the two, but it's also engaging in egoic activities from the position or the perspective of truth. So this involves seeing how our misperception of reality at the egoic level causes suffering and how it obscures seeing spirit, seeing the true reality. So really understanding or this misperception, seeing this misperception of reality, that there is this misperception of reality that causes suffering and clouds our seeing spirit. So the ego will always have this impulse to go somewhere, to do something, and to be a somebody. Right? But it can do all this from the point of view of truth, from spirit. So it's the approach that I'm offering here is kind of I guess you could call it a well-rounded approach. It acknowledges the different facets of existence, recognizing that ego, with its worldly pursuits, and spirit, with its timeless and transcendent nature, unlimited nature, we can live our lives from harmonizing those two aspects. So there's again the importance of connecting with spirit is so crucial in this. Spending some time dwelling in spirit. And this is why meditation is so crucial to this practice. Literally just sitting and noticing the gaps between thoughts, or noticing the stillness that's behind all the noise of the egoic mind is what I mean by dwelling in spirit or consciousness. So we're getting out of our fixation on the egoic activities in mind. Become disentangled from this dimension, from this narrow focus, this limited and narrow focus of personal desires, concerns, aversions, and so on. And when we're totally wrapped up in that, we tend to totally ignore truth. So I'm guiding here you towards a kind of a more comprehensive understanding. So in a way, I'm steering you away from ego-driven concerns towards a more spiritually aligned perspective, but not saying that we need to get rid of ego. So it's an intentional emphasis on connecting with spirit and redirecting our attention away from the confines, the limitations, the suffering that comes from ego fixation. And this is really the path towards awakening. It transcends the limited scope of the ego and its attachments, allowing for a truer perspective on reality. So the Buddha's teachings did this. In particular, the Noble Eightfold Path. If you find a similar interplay between ego and spirit in the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's the fourth noble truth out of the Four Noble Truths. That this is the path towards a cessation of suffering, is following this eightfold noble path. And I won't go into that in detail, but in there the Buddha highlights the significance of both ethical trainings, right? Right action, right speech, right livelihood. Those are all ethical trainings, right? Talking about ways to live, to earn a living and livelihood, ways to act in the world. Speech, and the Buddha often placed an emphasis on our words and our speech. And these are really, you can see how they're guiding egoic conduct, right? They're really guiding egoic activities towards a virtuous or a conduct that's congruent or aligned with awakening. So it's not, the Buddha never said, well, get rid of the ego and that's, the path. He said, here's eight steps or eight elements, and several of them are ways that guide the ego. And then, of course, he's got the wisdom trainings, which are facilitating a connection with spirit, right? The meditation practices, concentration, mindfulness, right effort, are the three that are placed there that help us connect with spirit. So you can see in the Eightfold Path really emphasizes the integration of ego and spirit, aligns the notion of balancing ego and spirit. It underscores the interconnected nature of ego and spirit. So really emphasizing the importance of balancing this development for a holistic and, you could say, enlightened way of living. So the ego doesn't disappear after awakening. It's important that we know how to balance these tendencies in our life. And the Eightfold Path is an example of this kind of teaching. And you'll hear teachers talk about, that we need to get rid of the ego. But, when you hear this, doesn't it sound like struggle? It sounds like a lot of struggle. Like, this is a fundamental aspect of your being a human, these egoic tendencies. And a practice that is telling us we need to get rid of it or eradicate it is really creating a huge amount of struggle. So I think it's much more productive, much more effective, much more compassionate to talk about how we can align our egoic tendencies with spirit, and at the same time how we can spend more time dwelling in spirit. And even after awakening, so the ego's there, right? The ego, there's still preferences. The Zen statement that, those without preferences will find the way. Well, it's really attachment to preferences that they're talking about. Preferences will still arise. But it's the attachment to the preference that causes the suffering, where the egoic thoughts are believed. And then the thought that follows is, well, if I don't get this, if I don't get my preference met, then I won't be happy. So I have to struggle with life in order to get what I want, and struggle with life so that I don't get what I don't want. So the ego will still be there. There'll still be preferences. I just discovered that I love stand-up desks. I didn't know I had that preference, but now I can't stop telling people how awesome stand-up desks are. Like, you can push a button and the desk goes up, and then you can be at your computer and kind of moving around and not just sitting in a chair. I don't have a stand-up YouTube desk yet, or stand-up Zoom desk, but maybe that'll come. So we have preferences. They do not go away. The ego will not go away. We're not eradicating the ego. We during the process of ego falling away, and when the ego's completely transcended or has completely fallen away, we continually, skillfully work with egoic impulses.